بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا. إنه من يهديه الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for coming tonight, inshallah. So we'll be doing these every Mondays and Thursdays, inshallah, at 8 o'clock after Isha prayer, inshallah. So on Mondays and Thursdays. So on Monday, we covered the second pledge of Al-Aqaba, Bayt Al-Aqaba Al-Thaniya. It talked about there's a new delegation from Yathrib, from Medina, arrived in Mecca. This new Hajj delegation, they had come to perform Hajj. 300 of them, there were 300 people. Of the 375 were Muslims, new Muslims, converts. Now the 75 had converted. Their conversions were not known to the rest of the group. The group which was led by Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul. So we talked about how the Prophet arranged to meet these people in secret. It had to be done in secret because Quraysh would, if they found out, it would cause a lot of problems, maybe even arrest these people, maybe even execute them. Who knows what they might do. So it had to be done in secret. Even the rest of the delegation, the non-Muslim people in the delegation, could not know that these 75 Muslims had met with the Prophet. They could not know. So these 75 people had come to meet the Prophet. They were new Muslims. They had never met the Prophet before. They never seen him. And also they had been discussing amongst themselves that they wanted the Prophet to leave Mecca, to go and live with them in Medina. They knew that it was a lot of trouble. Quraysh was causing a lot of problems, a lot of trouble for the Prophet and the Muslims in Mecca. And life was even in danger. So they wanted to ask him to leave Mecca, to go and live with them. So I talked about how they secretly moved. They met in a specific location in the middle of the night, far away from the rest of the Hajj, people performing Hajj, so away out of distance out of Mecca, in the middle of the night. And they made the second pledge of Al-Aqaba, listed there. The first four are similar to the first pledge of Al-Aqaba, made 1 year prior to this one. But the new part of the pledge was number 5, was to defend the Prophet, Sayyidina Muhammad if he was ever in trouble and he called upon their assistance, they would come ready to sacrifice themselves, to fight. And as soon as they made the pledge, they heard a loud voice in the distance, someone shouting, these people have made a pact, they are gathering, they're making they're conspiring to come and go to war against you. This is a voice in the distance trying to alert Mecca, the people, the Quraysh in Mecca, about what the Muslims have just done. Of course, nothing happened. The Prophet also informed the Ansar, these new Muslims from Medina, who that person was. It was actually the Shaitan himself. But he said, don't worry about it, and I will deal with him later. Despite all the precautions that the Prophet took, the Quraysh still found out what had happened. Maybe it was the same Shaitan, we don't know. They sent out their own delegation to meet with Abdullah ibn Ubay ibn Salul, to speak with him. Abdullah ibn Ubay, he denied anything had happened because it was done in secret and he didn't know there were Muslims in with a group that he was with. So he denied it. And so Quraysh left him. But then later on, they had confirmation that this meeting actually did happen with the Prophet and these Ansar. But by that time, the people who had gone to Hajj had already left. They had picked up, they left the camp and they were already going home. Quraysh managed to capture one person, but then they let him go. However, this situation was caused a lot of alarm, a lot of concern in Mecca amongst Quraysh. They were very worried as to what might happen. Would all the Muslims leave Mecca and go live in Medina? What if Islam would have spread not in Medina but in the rest of the Arabian Peninsula? What would be the situation be like then? They were very afraid of what this might lead to. But then the order came down from Allah to immigrate. So from Allah to the Prophet to the Muslims, they had to immigrate. And they immigrated again in secrecy. The majority of them immigrated from secrecy from Mecca to Medina. There were one notable exception, but even the Prophet himself, he immigrated in complete secrecy. The exception, of course, was Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab. He deliberately went out in public and said, I'm leaving Mecca now, and anybody of you dares to come and stop me, let him come. And he said that with holding a sword in his hand, daring anybody to come and stop him. Of course, nobody could stop him. They were all afraid of him. And in addition to that, 20 people, even of the 20 of the Muslims, of the weaker Muslims, those who didn't have proper protection, they traveled with Sayyidina Umar in safety to Medina. The Prophet, of course, waited until all the other people had immigrated and he stayed behind. And he instructed Abu Bakr and Ali to stay behind in Mecca with him. So those three, but including Abu Bakr, had his family as well, stayed behind in Mecca. Okay, so today we'll discuss the Prophet's own immigration to Medina, inshallah. Now, Quraysh had been alerted as to that the Muslims were leaving, except they didn't know when or how they were leaving. They would just wake up and find people going missing one day. So, and then the fact that they knew that Muslims were leaving Mecca and going to Medina, the Quraysh knew this was happening. Abu Jahl's own half brother, Manab Aish ibn Abi Rabia, had converted to Islam and he had immigrated to Medina. So Abu Jahl did not like that. He traveled from Mecca all the way to Medina to tell his brother. It was a trick. It was trying to fool him to get him to come back to Mecca. He said their mother was dying. She was very ill and she was dying. He needed to come back and see their mother. So he believed him, and they all went back to Mecca. But Abu Jahl locked him up and held him as a prisoner in Mecca. Prevented him to go all the way back to Medina. So the fact that the Muslims were leaving Mecca to Medina was well known amongst the hierarchy in Mecca. Quraysh were very concerned as to because of the situation they were in now. Number one, because the people who were leaving, they were family members. They were related. They were from Mecca itself. These were brothers and sons and fathers and sisters and daughters, all leaving Mecca to go and live in Medina. The second reason that they were concerned about the situation is that they were afraid if Islam were to spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula, Quraysh would suffer an economic decline. So they'll lose trade in the idols, because they manufacture idols and sell them, trading in alcohol and other haram trades. They're also thinking in future, what if the Muslims were to become powerful? What if they were to come back to Mecca but with a powerful army and conquer Mecca? That means Quraysh would be conquered by these Muslims that they were trying to suppress and kill. Now, the city of Medina as well, I'm talking about from the point of view of Quraysh, was the worst place the Muslims could go to. Of course, for the Muslims, Medina was a strategically brilliant place to live, to be in. But from Quraysh's perspective, they were thinking that the two Arab tribes living in Medina, also Khazraj, they had a reputation for being very skilled warriors in the Arabian Peninsula, very powerful, strong. Number one. And number two, the two tribes living in Medina belong to the Qahtani branch. So the Arabs there's the Qahtani branch and there's the Adnani branch. So there's two branches always opposed each other, always fought each other. So the tribes in Medina belong to the Qahtani branch, and Mecca, Quraysh belong to the Adnani branch. So that's another reason as to why they were afraid that they didn't want Medina to fall to the Muslims. Number three, Medina had very good natural fortifications. So surrounded by mountains on some sides, maybe by forests or a swamp maybe on other sides. So it was very easy to fortify the city because it already had some natural fortifications and it was very difficult to conquer Medina. In addition to that, Medina, another reason why Quraysh was afraid, that didn't want Medina to become Muslim, is that Medina was sitting right on the trade route between Mecca and the Levant. So Palestine, Syria, was sitting in the middle. If their trade caravans were to pass, the people in Medina could easily capture these caravans. And the last reason is that Quraysh knew about the three powerful tribes living in Medina. Very powerful. If the Jewish tribes were to ally themselves with the Muslims, they would be maybe even unstoppable. So Quraysh saw that, they were thinking that if they could control the Prophet and prevent him from leaving Mecca, they would perhaps mitigate, lessen mitigate the situation they were in, the bad situation, if the Muslims were, because the Muslims were going to take over Medina and cause all this trouble for them. They would reduce all this trouble if they could control the Prophet, maybe even kill him. So, what did they do? They held a meeting in Dar al-Nadwa on the 26th of Safar. So, they invited all the representatives from all the major tribes in Mecca, except for Bani Hashim. Bani Hashim being the Prophet's own tribe. They invited them to a meeting to talk about what they needed to do, what they needed to do to control this situation. Now, during this meeting, there is some historians have said that Iblis himself attended this meeting in the form of a human being, but there's actually no evidence, credible evidence to say that he was there. Now, some people of the opinion that they would just lock up the Prophet someplace and leave him, maybe in a room or a prison or jail or something, and just leave him there. Other people, the more extreme opinion was to kill the Prophet. And this idea was, Abu Jahl was the one who proposed this idea, to kill the Prophet. And he said, what you could do to kill him is to get a young man from each of the big tribes, form what you would call a task force, a small group of people that would go to the Prophet's house in the middle of the night, and when he leaves the house, you stab him, you all kill him or stab him with spears or swords. Each person would stab the Prophet. And that way, they would all share the blame for killing the Prophet. And then they would force the Prophet's own tribe, the tribe of Bani Hashim, to accept a blood money as compensation for the death of one of their people. Because Bani Hashim would not be able to go to war against all the other tribes. So that was all the other attendees agreed to this plan, and they said they decided that the Prophet would be killed around Fajr time, which is when the time when the Prophet would leave his house, normally, probably to go and pray Fajr prayer. And there's one verse in the Quran that talks about this meeting with يمكر بك الذين كفروا ليثبتوك أو يقتلوك أو يخرجوك ويمكرون ويمكر الله والله خير الماكرين. Surah Al-Anfal. Now, as soon as the Quraysh had made this decision to kill the Prophet, Jibreel comes to the Prophet and tells him what has happened. He tells here the Prophet that the Quraysh are conspiring to kill you, and they're going to do this and this and this, and they're going to do it at a certain time, at night or at Fajr time. So the Prophet then, now he knows what's happening. He asks, Jibreel then instructs the Prophet he has to leave Mecca. He can't stay another day in Mecca. So he said, and so the Prophet or I'm not sure if the Prophet or if Jibreel told him to leave that night. He had all day to prepare for the trip. So the Prophet also then asked Jibreel, who will accompany me? Who will come with me? So Jibreel told him Abu Bakr. The fact that Jibreel told the Prophet Abu Bakr meant that Allah had chosen Abu Bakr to travel with the Prophet. So the Prophet now needed to come up with a plan to escape Mecca and evade capture, as he knew he was a wanted man. So he had to move around in secrecy without when people are not around, people not watching and surveilling him. At the same time, not only did he have to leave Mecca, he had been entrusted by people in Mecca with keeping their valuables in a safe place. So the Prophet had to return these valuables to these people. So the Prophet decided to go to Abu Bakr's house at noon. So at noon, when the heat would be the strongest, and the people nobody would be in the streets. People would be sheltering at home to protect out of the heat. So that was the time, and it wasn't normal for him to leave the streets at that time. So people would not be expecting him to be walking in the streets of Mecca at that time. So he goes to Abu Bakr, and he meets with him and tells him. Before that, he decides to. He speaks to his cousin Sayyidina Ali. He tells him there are two things he had to do. The first thing was that night Ali would stay in the Prophet's house. The Prophet would not stay in his house. Sayyidina Ali would stay there. He'd sleep in the Prophet's bed, and he'd be wearing the Prophet's own cloak. I think it was a green-colored cloak, and sleep in the Prophet's bed. This was to trick, because the Prophet knew that there were assassins coming to kill him. So he wanted the assassins, when they looked inside, to see somebody sleeping in the bed, in the Prophet's own bed, wearing something the Prophet normally would wear. They'll think that the Prophet was still inside the house, and they wouldn't think of looking for him anywhere else. That was the first task Sayyidina Ali had to do. The second task was to return the valuables. Those valuables that had been trusted to the Prophet. He would stay behind in Mecca after the Prophet had left and return all those valuables to their owners. The Prophet then goes to Abu Bakr's house at noon and tells him what's happening. He tells him that he's been instructed to leave Mecca and that Abu Bakr will be going with him. For Abu Bakr, even before the Prophet had told him, he already proactively prepared two camels. Prepared them for the journey, just in case the Prophet would come to him and say, we have to go now. So the Prophet, as I said, had to formulate a plan as to how they would leave Mecca and where would they go, what would they do. So the Prophet would spend the night at Abu Bakr's house instead of his own house. They would not exit, so when it comes for them to leave, they would not exit at the front door of Abu Bakr's house. The house had another exit from the back end, and they would exit from there. They would exit Mecca before Fajr time. And even then, from one of those, not from the main gate into Mecca, but from one of the lesser known gates that hardly anybody uses. And then they would hire a guide to guide them. They would not be using the usual route from Mecca to Medina. They'll be using a different route that sort of zigzags, partially along the coast, partially inland. So they knew somebody who knew that all the routes, desert routes, very well. So they decided to hire a man named Abdullah ibn Uraqat, who was not a Muslim. Suraqa? Suraqa is the one who followed them later. Yeah, but the guide was Abdullah ibn Uraqat. So they hired this person whom nobody would suspect of helping the Prophet. At the same time, the Prophet knew that Abdullah ibn Uraqat was trustworthy, that he would not go and tell everybody else or reveal the Prophet's plans to Quraysh. The plan, again, the Prophet decided to head south. Instead of directly going north from Mecca to Medina, they would head south about a distance of about 8 kilometers to the mountain where Ghar Thawr is. And this was a mountain, so they had to climb a mountain to get to the cave. They would stay in that cave for 3 days. And hopefully by the end of the 3 days, Quraysh would, they would be alert and they would be looking for the Prophet for 3 days, and hopefully by 3 days they would have given up. So then they would be able to leave the cave and go to Medina. After 3 days, they would meet up with Abdullah ibn Urayqat. He would bring the camels that Abu Bakr had prepared, because they didn't take the camels with them. They walked from Mecca to Ghar Thawr. And then they would travel with Abdullah. Now, in order for the Prophet to keep himself up to date with events in Mecca, he got Abu Bakr's own son, Abdullah ibn Abi Bakr, to stay in Mecca during the day, and at night he would leave Mecca, go to Ghar Thawr and update the Prophet and his father about what was happening in Mecca, give them news every day. He'd spend the night in Ghar Thawr, and then at Fajr time he would leave and go back to Mecca and stay there for the whole day. So the people in Mecca would see him and think that he had not gone anywhere. Abu Bakr's own servant, Amir ibn Fuhayra, had a herd of sheep, so he would bring the sheep, and when after the Prophet Abu Bakr had left Mecca, he would get the sheep to walk over the tracks, to cover over the tracks, and so nobody would see that there were tracks in the Prophet and Abu Bakr's tracks in the desert. And last of all, Abu Bakr's own daughter, said Asma, would travel the whole distance, all 8 kilometers, every day to bring food for them. Now, Asma radiallahu anha was also pregnant. Now, and she was near the end of the pregnancy as well, so difficult for her to walk 8 kilometers. But this was all the more perfect. She was more perfect for this, because nobody would suspect a pregnant woman to be walking 8 kilometers every day. Oh, no, not 8, 16 kilometers. So 8 kilometers going to the Mount Ghar Thawr and 8 kilometers to go back to Mecca. Not only that, she would go walk to the mountain and even climb the mountain to the cave to bring them the food. So that was the plan. The Prophet Rasulullah returned to his house after being with Abu Bakr, and stayed in his house until the early evening to prepare himself for the trip. And when it was time for him to leave his own house, he discovered that the assassins had already come early. The assassins were supposed to come later, because the plan was to kill him at around Fajr time, which meant that the Prophet was essentially trapped in his own house. So at that very moment, Jibreel comes to him and says to him, walk out from the front door. No, do not worry. And they will not see you. So the Prophet walks out. As he walks out in front of all the assassins, they don't see him, and he's reciting Surah Yasin. And on top of that, to prove to them he walked in front of them, he gets some sand and puts it on the head of each one of the assassins. A bit of sand on their heads. So he goes to Abu Bakr's house in safety and stays with him up until very late at night when they plan to leave. Back at the Prophet's house, where Ali was sleeping, the assassins were waiting outside, waiting to kill him. One person was walking past and sees the assassins just waiting there, looking very silly with sand on their heads. And he asked them, "What are you doing here?" They said, "We're waiting for the Prophet, for Muhammad to come out." And he says to them, "He's already gone." So they can't believe it, what's going on. And they looked inside from the window, you could see somebody sleeping in the Prophet's own bed wearing the Prophet's cloak. So they didn't know what to do. So they started to wait. Why? Couldn't they just break into the house? Because this was against the customs of the Arabs. They didn't break into somebody's house, private property. So they waited until Fajr time, and then when they saw Ali, Sayyidina Ali, he got up, they saw him, and when he exited the house, they captured him, they beat him up, and held him prisoner for about 1 hour. Now, so going back to the Prophet and Abu Bakr, at the agreed a certain time, that the planned time, they left the house in the middle of the night, where everybody else most of Mecca was asleep, and started to head towards Ghar al-Thawr, walking. And when they get to Ghar al-Thawr, at the top of the mountain or middle of the mountain, Abu Bakr actually entered the cave first to check that the place was safe. There were no snakes or any dangerous animals hiding inside. So Abu Bakr was very, very concerned, very protective of the Prophet.